Okay, I'm going to go into the first section of this talk. I've divided them roughly into 5-minute sections, and each is important like a stage. So think of this like a kind of symphony with different movements. So the first thing I want to talk about is where I'm coming from philosophically, in terms of ethics, because Brexit is an ethical choice amongst everything else, and I'm a philosopher and a metaphysician. I'm looking at this from a metaphysical perspective as a philosopher. I coordinate Philosophers for Peace in Europe, and I'm vice president globally. So my interest is in any decision I make, is this going to lead to violence and conflict? Is this going to lead to peace and reconciliation? That to me is a fundamental ethical premise from where I'm coming from. And I will choose the peace option always. And why is because I'm coming from a place of what you could call philosophical monism. That is, I believe the universe is a divine unity. And our mind, our reason, our consciousness is part of that unity as human beings. Sir George Trevelyan used to say we are droplets of God. If you want, theos, the Greek word, as in theosophy, is the divine unity itself. And then the human mind can learn to tap into that, to plug into it, through meditation, reflection, contemplation, and the experience of the mysteries. In the classical world, you went to your Eleusis, you had your mysteries experience. And that blew you into the experience of oneness. It's thought they use some kind of psychedelic substance to increase that sense of oneness. A lot of people now, in the shamanic tradition, using ayahuasca or whatever, that is what dissolves the ego into that place of oneness. And the classical European tradition comes from that place of profound unity and ultimately love, because with the experience of unity comes love. And this is why Plato, who was an initiate of the mystery schools of Athens, and he'd studied in Egypt, he'd travelled in Sicily, he was the founder of philosophy in the West, one of them, argued that the one is good. The divine unity that we all come from, and that the entire planet does, and that all the planets and all the galaxies come from, is good. And when we experience that unity in the mind, it's enlightenment. Like Shankara and Buddha and all the others talk about, there's a sense of unity. When we experience it at the heart, it's love and a sort of communion on an emotional basis. And physically, then it becomes manifest as friendship, sharing, cooperation, etc., etc. So that's really the place I'm coming from, and that's my start point when I make ethical choices. And I just want to lay my cards on the table. Right, moving on to the second section then. So metaphysics, this talk is called the Metaphysics of Politics. It's not really much discussed in Parliament. I listen to these people and with all due respect I despair, because they're so polarised, they're so shallow in their thinking, most of them. One or two of these thinkers, like the SNP, when they get up sometimes they say some quite deep stuff. Dominic Grieve has been saying some intelligent stuff, and some of the Labour people. Caroline Lucas always seems to say quite intelligent stuff, but I despair of the kind of the level of debate. I did organise 36 meetings in Parliament to try and get debate about philosophy, and I was tempted to try and set up a philosophy club for parliamentarians, but I can't do everything, and once I moved out of London it became more difficult. Metaphysics was launched by Aristotle, and it's the study of that unity. So I've started by saying there's a monism, there's a unity. Aristotle said, okay, so how does it work, and what are the details? And in his book, Metaphysics, he ultimately said that the whole universe operates through the power and force of love. That is how the one intermanages its relationships. And we're drawn towards unity in a sense of love. Now, I'm going to argue, therefore, that my position, which is keeping the United Kingdom together and keeping the United Kingdom as a whole inside the EU, is coming from a place of the love of unity. The UK itself was born out of a fierce search for unity. And it's symbolised by the saints on the flags, Patrick, Andrew, St George and so on. And that was designed by King James VI of Scotland when he became the King of the first Great Britain, as it was called then. He wanted to symbolise the divine unity at the heart of this country. And of course it wasn't always like that. There were tribal wars when the Anglo-Saxons first turned up, invading in the 5th century. They were pretty barbaric people. They were illiterate, they were warriors and farmers. They had some rune masters who knew something about esoteric philosophy, but they're a pretty wild bunch. The British inhabitants and the Irish had become part of an advanced Christian culture by then, stemming from Gaul. And St. Columba, the great Irish saint on Iona, had already started Christian teachings and so on in Mercia and the whole of Scotland, and Wales had been Christian already for some time before the Anglo-Saxons turned up. So the Anglo-Saxons were a challenge really to these islands, but gradually they became civilized. They were taught to read and write. They founded their abbeys. They founded the monastery at where Bede was, and they became great scholars in their own right. And King Alfred the Great, who was one of the greatest kings of the Anglo-Saxons, who was a Christian, but also a learned man in classical sense, he said we can only base our country's survival on education. So he founded in all the monasteries schools, and he had monks come over from Europe. He was a Europhile, Alfred. He'd been to Rome and been blessed by the then Pope. And he was a lover of learning. So he made sure the libraries were all stocked with books. So this is why it's very symbolic to be meeting here at the library. Now, I'm going to argue that this love of learning is at the heart of all that's best about British culture, and also European culture. Our greatest kings and queens, like Elizabeth and all the others, were also lovers of learning. You know, there's a Royal Library at Windsor. The King George III, although he was slightly bonkers, sadly, in the end, and made some terrible mistakes, like not giving Americans more say in their democracy, he was a great patron of learning, and his private library went to the nation, became the kernel of the British Library. Now, the EU is also a place of great learning, and I'm arguing that the European Union is based on this same metaphysics of love that the UK is, so there needn't be a clash between the two. The European Union, many of the founders of it were advanced Christian thinkers and activists for peace at the end of World War II, which was the most horrendous war the planet's ever seen. They said, we've got to do something to prevent this happening again. So they thought of this idea, which was based on the work of David Mitrani, who was a very advanced social scientist based in Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies, with Einstein. He was working on physics, he was working on social thought. And he thought of this idea of functionalism, which is if you interlock warring cultures at the level of like coal and steel or transport or basic needs, it becomes less useful for them to then war and fight. They become interdependent, codependent. And that was the idea of the EU, gradually interlock these once warring nations. And Jean Monnet was a very great thinker and philosopher. De Rougemont, another intellectual behind the European Union, wrote a book on passion and society, and he looked at the role of the Cathars and the troubadour tradition in European intellectual history. And he said, we are fundamentally a continent based on love. What makes Europe tick is love. And if you go back even to Odysseus and the Homeric epics, again, the wars are about misunderstanding what to do about love. Somebody pinching somebody's girl, and then somebody wanting revenge, and then, trying to get home afterwards. So right from Homer's Odysseus, where the homecoming is one of finding your way back to love. That's a symbol of European soul, if you want, which James Joyce later picks up on in Ulysses. It's this eternal quest for love at the heart of the project. And another very great philosopher, Kojev, was a Hegelian Russian who ended up teaching in Paris. France has been the haven of many intellectuals over the centuries, and I'm compiling a dictionary. I keep coming across people I didn't know he was in France. And they're going to be in my list. Like Joyce took refuge in Europe, of course. So Kojev was the greatest Hegelian philosopher of the 20th 20th century. He gave lectures in Paris that all the later generation of French philosophers like Sartre and so on used to come to. And he ended up his life working for the early European Union. He saw this as a project that was the realization of the spiritual aspirations of not just humanity, well, humanity as well as European humanity. And he's actually buried in Brussels close to the Commission. He's like one of the founding saints of the European Union. Nobody knows the depth of the people, of the thinking that's gone into it. The idea behind it was to combine the best of liberal democracy, social democracy. Now there is an element of intellectual aristocracy in the European Union. In the European tradition there is a place for aristocracy. The best and the most suited should do the right jobs. So in the Commission you're appointed. And I don't think we'd want it anywhere else, would we? I mean, we wouldn't want someone in charge of the agricultural policy of Europe who's never looked at a farm or knows nothing about it. We need people that actually have experience in the respective fields. And so the European Commission is a kind of intellectual aristocracy. But there's an element always of political democratic control, and through the European Parliament, there's the democratic input. Aristotle said the best form of governance is elements of aristocracy mixed with elements of democracy and elements of monarchy even. And we still have many monarchs left in Europe, so we've actually got the best of all worlds here. There's another more esoteric aspect to the European project, which I've only really discovered having moved to France. When I lived in Britain and studied esoteric history, I got very interested in things like Freemasonry and occultism and esoteric traditions, looking at the esoteric history of humanity, how these Freemasons and so on descended from the ancient mystery cults, and their rituals and initiations and so on. Well, they're very active in Europe as well, you see. And I bought the idea that, well, Britain is the haven of all this. We founded Freemasonry, and we're the most esoteric of all the countries in the world, and rule Britannia. It's sort of esoteric exceptionalism. But having moved to France, I've discovered that's a complete not true. I mean, the French are profound esotericists, and Freemasonry is extremely important in France. It kind of runs the country. Napoleon was a Mason. The whole Napoleonic project was based on that, which is why he loved Egypt. He was looking for the source of the mysteries. The whole crave of Egypt, discoveries, and Champollion, who translated the hieroglyphs first into a European language, was a product of Napoleon's Masonic obsession with the mysteries of Egypt. And so really that whole conflict of Napoleon versus the British was actually an intellectual error. We should have been cooperating. Now what's the basis? So French Freemasonry was partly founded by Scottish Freemasons, Jacobite exiles, Chevalier Ramsay, Charles Radcliffe and others, who were very important Masonic exiles in the Jacobite tradition, who went to France, founded these lodges, one in Bordeaux, later one in Paris. I went to Bordeaux recently and was researching all this. And they were a haven of really deep esoteric thought that was active in the Jacobite circles. Because the Stuart monarchs supported all this esoteric thing. They saw their monarchy, James, took it very seriously. And this is what he meant by the divine, he should have said the divine duty of kings. It's not the divine right of kings. That's the wrong words that came out, which caused all the trouble. Divine responsibilities of monarchs is what he meant. And these Stuart exiles and Jacobites knew all this. They had these rituals. Now, there was an extraordinary man that I'd heard of, I didn't realise how important he was until I went to France, called Martinez de Pasquale, who was a master esoteric Mason. He was from the West Indies. He thought to be partly of Jewish origin, partly Catholic, very mysterious character in Bordeaux and elsewhere. And he set up a group of Freemasons who were devoted to the highest level of initiation. They did arcane rituals, they did prayers, they had lodges where they invoked the archangels behind the universe to come and inspire the members and so on. And he wrote a book which is very important in French intellectual history called On the Reintegration of Spirits. And this book is a commentary on the book of Genesis. It was published in about mid-1700s. And he argued, basing it partly on the Kabbalah, I think, that in the beginning of the creation, this world was supposed to be a beautiful place of happiness, peace, and love. Everyone was supposed to be in the right place, doing the right thing with the right person. But there was a sort of fall, there was a chaos set in, and some of the spirits got into the wrong places. And that's been going on ever since. So in society, some really good people have absolutely no power and influence. They're homeless on the street. And some really evil, wicked, immoral people are like running governments and running the military. How? Martinez's book tries to explain this. And he then puts forward his solution, which is the reintegration of spirits, which is through this esoteric work, things like Freemasonry and advanced inner work, everyone will eventually go back to where they belong. So it's not like anybody's really evil and really good. It's just they're in the wrong place, right? And that work is what he calls reintegration. Now, I come to the view that when the European Union and European intellectuals talk about the duty of reintegration, this is the big word that Europeans love. They want to reintegrate Europe. And the British literally don't understand what they're talking about. They think, oh my God, dreadful. Oh, world federalism, we hate it. We want to be, wild tribesmen doing our thing. There's a huge conversational gap going on. And it's at the level of these esoteric groups, because the English Freemasons in their lodges, who by and large run the Tory party and most other institutions in politics of the UK, they have never read Martinez de Pasquale. He's banned from their bookshelves. They've never delved into the metaphysics of their own tradition. Instead, they use their Freemasonry as a sort of social advancement thing for little local insurance clerks and stuff. And they never actually know what they're supposed to be doing, which is reintegrating the spiritual chaos that we're faced with. Anyway, and reintegration is what unity and peace is about. It's surely what Christ came for, and what all messiahs, past and future, would come for. So this work is hugely significant at a spiritual level. It's not, and that is symbolised by the work of the European Union. So before people criticise and shout at it, they should know where it's come from and how deep it goes. Right, I'm going to move on to the next thing now. Right, so I've explained that where I'm coming from is a place of unity and monism, metaphysical, philosophical monism. There is another tradition called dualism in ethics and metaphysics, which is going back to Zoroastrianism and other sources, which says, no, that's not true. There are two ultimate deities behind the universe. There's an ultimately good God, Ahura Mazda, and then there's a really wicked evil principle, Angra Mainyu. And there's a cosmic battle going on between these two more or less equal principles. And this idea, which I don't agree with, I think it can be explained psychologically, right? I think we need to do a Jungian analysis of the devil image, which he did in his writings, and which I've attempted in my study of what I call comparative diabology. I've been looking at the role of the devil in all these different faith traditions. The devil came in, it was invented in Zoroastrianism. It then strongly influenced Judaism. And in the time of the exile, the Jews studied in Babylon with Zoroastrians, and they bought this idea of this war between good and evil, devil and God. And that's when the Bible that we have today was first written down, under the influence of that thought, which is why we have the Genesis story, why Satan is always doing naughty stuff, and why mankind needs to be saved, and why the chosen people have to do the saving. It was all post-dualist thinking. That in turn influenced this whole idea of messianism. Because if you have an absolute war between absolute good and absolute evil, and mankind stuck in the middle, which is what they say, then you need somebody to lead the good forces and rally them, and that becomes known as the Messiah, or the Seishant. In Zoroastrianism, the word is the Seishant, the Redeemer or Messiah. And that idea then inspired certain esoteric groups in Judea, the Essenes and the Enochian Jewish traditions, which were studying the books of Enoch, which first talk about this. The Son of Man is going to come from the heaven worlds, will come into incarnation and rally the forces of light, lead mankind back to light. And that really, we know now through scholarship that Christ, the young Christ, read the Book of Enoch. That was his sort of manual for how to be a Messiah, if you want. And he took on that role. And it, of course, wasn't accepted by everybody. But that's the very origin of Christianity, because he thought, being a dualist, he was fighting this war of light versus dark, and he was leading the forces of light against the dark forces. This then in turn influenced Manichaean thought, who was an extremist of that variety. He took this war thing very seriously, and he said, that Christ had done well but hadn't finished the job. Now Mani was going to absolutely seal the deal and liberate all the souls that could be liberated, and the rest were going to go to the fire. You can't save everybody, according to Mani, because the devil is too powerful. Now, I've discovered in recent research that this then influenced strongly Islamic thought. The whole idea of Islam is that Muhammad comes along and is the prophet who seals the deal. Because Mani failed, he was martyred, he was literally flayed alive by the Shah of Persia, and his followers scattered to the winds, China and whatever. But they were very active in a town called Hikmah, which was right on the border, the Lakhmid kingdom, with Mecca and Medina, and they first invented the Arabic alphabet. It was Arabic Manichaeans who invented the Arabic alphabet, which then taught the people of Mecca and Medina, who were going on merchant trails, including young Muhammad, sitting at the feet of these Manichaean Christian esoteric Gnostics. And an awful lot of what's in Islam, in the Quran, came from that source, the Manichaean idea, including things like their great fast that they do, followed by the feast at the end of their fast, of the month of fasting. And many of the customs in Islam actually are Manichaean, it turns out. This is a field of comparative religious studies that's going on at the moment. But what it means is that Islam does have that strong dualistic thing. It believes it's fighting the war of absolute good against absolute evil. And there are variants, the Shia version, the Sunni, etc. But when we see in the Middle East, as we'll see a bit later, it's this theological dualism is then applied politically, which is very dangerous. Because I would say it leads to this is all a very great oversimplification of ultimate truth. If you take a different perspective and say, no, it's a monistic thing, there's no absolute evil, absolute good, there's shades of grey and the rainbow, then this is all a gross oversimplification of good against evil. And I would say, for instance, there's such a thing as what I call holistic dualism, which is where, yes, life comes in a dialectic. You have a god and a goddess. In tantric holistic dualism, you have Shiva and Shakti, or yin and yang, and that's fine. In the god and the goddess in the Celtic Druid tradition, they're both important. One isn't better than the other; they go together, and that's holistic dualism. But what you have is toxic dualism, when you separate ontologically these into absolute categories. And say the one is absolutely good and everything to do with that one is absolutely bad. I would say it's the return of the goddess, which is popular in feminist theological circles, that converts toxic dualism back to holistic dualism. For instance, they've now discovered that Ahura Mazda, the source of all this, the good god, actually has a consort, Armaite, who's the earth goddess. Ahura Mazda doesn't have to do it all alone. He's got Gaia as his consort in Persian, ancient religion. And in Judaism, Yahweh has a wife, consort, Asherah. And in the Kabbalah, she's hinted at, and you can see it. But I know groups in Israel that are working to re-invoke the goddess up front and involve the green rooms and stuff. This is the solution to this toxic dualism, but not everybody's got the message. Okay. So moving on, we come to the next section, which is about political dualism. So I've explained how metaphysically there's this dualism, which is dangerous, but very influential. And then it gets even more dangerous when it's converted into political dualism, which is the kind of aftershock of the metaphysical dualism. Now you get two different forms of this. to generalise, you get a very extreme left-wing dualism, which is the extreme Bolshevik position, or Trotskyite, or the eternal revolution of the good Reds against the bad Whites. And in extreme Marxist form, it becomes pretty toxic. It was there in the French Revolution with Robespierre. You know, the terrorist, in the name of the good, kills everybody that doesn't follow the party line. In Maoist left-wing ideology, extreme Marxism, it led to the mass slaughter of millions of Chinese people. If you were a Confucian intellectual, you were humiliated and tortured during the Cultural Revolution. And in Cambodia as well, it led to mass killings. So that toxic dualism of the extreme left is very dangerous. It's a purely secular form, but its roots go back to this kind of metaphysical dualism I talked about. And I christen this disaster socialism. You know, let's have a revolution, bring everything down, smash everything, run riot in the streets, and then we'll have the socialist revolution, and then everything will be better. You know, and unfortunately it doesn't work. So then on the other side, there's a hard right political dualism, the extreme right, which normally takes the form of a kind of racist or nationalist absolutism. The Volk, the people is sacred, the nation is holy. And this was the foundation of Nazism and fascism. And of course, it needs an enemy to fixate on, so often it becomes quite anti-Semitic. It opposes internationalism, and it opposes what is now called globalism. And because the Jews didn't have a homeland, they were wandering about, all they had was trades, and they were used to dealing with money since the Middle Ages, so they kind of were involved in the growth and birth of capitalism. So they were easy to point the finger of blame at. And anti-Semitism became associated with the hard right, and led to the horrors of Nazi and fascist anti-Semitism. And this was a way of saying, well, the Jews are absolutely evil, thus they need to be destroyed. Now, the nationalist rhetoric of the hard right, which is behind Brexit, I'm arguing, in the hands of people like Steve Bannon, the American nationalist leader, who's been trumpeting his wares around Europe, stirring up nationalist piles in Europe, working with Le Pen in France, and nationalists and neo-fascists in Italy and elsewhere, and Hungary, stirring the pot of neo-nationalism. And they're reinventing history and saying, no, well, actually the Nazis and fascists, they were the good guys. Now this goes in with a resurgent white racism on the part of the people behind Steve Bannon in America, and the America First ideology of extreme right nationalism was then transported to Britain through Farage, who is a friend of Steve Bannon and stays with him when he's in New York, and they very cleverly, through creating data analytica by capturing the vote in the referendum in 2016, were able to, without saying anything about what's in the tin, they masqueraded it and pretended it was all very benign, and we're the good guys, was their argument. But actually, if you scratch, as I've done, behind the scenes of people like Bannon and his kin, who then took over the Republican Party and ran the policy of Trump for the first year. Steve Bannon was his advisor. The people around Trump, they follow ideologically a kind of extreme individualism, what can be called egotistic individualism as an ideology. It's associated with a thinker called Ayn Rand, who was a Russian Jewish exile in America. And she wrote various novels and political tracts, and she argued socialism is absolutely evil. Social democracy is evil. The only thing that is good is absolute extreme individualism and egotism. Me, I'm out for myself. And it was a kind of sort of extreme opposite, like a caricature almost of the socialist and ideas of community and so on. The trouble is its influence, these hard right people in America like Steve Bannon and Trump and his coterie and all the people around him. So when Bannon, and this is why they hate the EU, because the EU on the whole is a soft left, social democratic, we're all in this together, let's share and work out how we can share the continent in peace. kind of project. Now, Steve Bannon worked as a Cold War warrior. He was in the American military at a senior level. And he was trained to spy on Russians and spot communists wherever he could and kill them, you know, and destroy communism. These are the people that they're triumphalists. They think they destroyed the evils of socialism. The last thing they've got to destroy is the European Union. And Bannon's been quoted as saying his mission is to drive a stake through the heart of the European Union. Well, my job is to put a shield up and say, no, you will not. You know, you're the bad guys. I won't tolerate this nonsense because it's a caricature of actual European intellectual life. You know, and it comes from this place of extreme political dualism. It's so fanatically self-confident in its belief that it's I am right and you are wrong, that it will destroy anything that opposes it. And that's why Trump wants to build this wall. I mean, it's very interesting. If I was giving this talk in the USA, Trumpism is leading to extreme political dualism as well. The polarization of opinion in America is extreme. And people can't stand Trump or they love him. There's no middle ground now. And it's all polarizing around the wall. He shut the government down literally until he gets his war against Mexico, which is a racist thing to be wanting to do. It's like keeping out those Hispanics, keeping out those Catholics. They're not good Americans. Even though it was Mexican Catholics who actually discovered California and named San Francisco and all that. Fray Junipero Serra, one of my theological heroes, he was a great Lovian professor of philosophy. And Raymond Lull was one of the great mystical founders of European thought who influenced Leibniz and the rest of philosophy. And was not a dualist, you know. He was a Sufi-influenced, Kabbalistic Christian who wanted divine unity, which is my position. So Bannon and people, they've never done their ethical studies. I heard him speak at the Oxford Union. He's never trained in philosophy. These are political agitators for the hard right. But they captured the imagination of the British public that voted for Brexit marginally, and they were forced to vote by political propaganda techniques and brainwashing of a very sophisticated level, using people who were actually using military propaganda techniques to win that referendum, because they think they are fighting literally a war against social democracy and liberalism. For these people, liberalism is a catastrophic, terrible, you know, they're out to kill liberalism. Well, I'm not. You know, I'm a fan of Gladstone, I'm a fan of the liberal tradition of European intellectual history, Beccaria and Bentham, and you know, we need more liberalism, not less. But we need an intelligent kind, and you need to think it through. And also, I don't approve of the kind of racist undertones of this hard right, neo-nationalism. Anti-immigration is a kind of racist position based on this idea of the purity of the blood. The Spaniards invented this when they kicked the Jews out of Spain. And the Moors, you have to be 100% Spanish, you know, prove the purity of your blood, which is what the Nazis were saying. Well, to me, all human blood is sacred. I don't care the colour of your skin. And also, if you look at this from a theosophical perspective, we have many incarnations over many lifetimes in all different races and tribes of humanity. I know from some of my past life research, you know, I've not always been British, I've travelled around the world. This is everybody's birthright. We're one cosmic soul here in incarnation. So I think my analysis here of political dualism is it's very dangerous. And the liberal tradition I'm talking about needs to be defended. And it stands for political monism, which is we're one community, we're a rainbow nation, as Mandela said. We're you know, poor, rich, middle class, all of us are in this together. We have to find a way of organising society that everybody benefits and that we can stay at peace. We cannot afford this fanatical dualist rhetoric